Thanks for tuning in to Liberación Army Radio. This is episode 2 of our podcast. This episode is scheduled to release on March 31st, 2025. And today we'll be talking about Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Hasan Piker's podcast and whether or not they're real leftists. Next, we'll cover Sudan, Congo, Palestine, and Mexico. We'll talk about the expansion of the Tren and the PAN party in Chihuahua with their religious campaign. Finally, we're going to talk about canceling people, especially Trump supporters, and contextualize it in a small business scandal, which resembles the mass witch hunt for Republicans on social media.
Are you excited for our second podcast episode?
Yeah. Are you?
Yeah. It's
Good.
really weird. It's surreal to see or to hear rather our podcast all over a bunch of different platforms. So yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. So current events, we're going to talk about domestic current events first, specifically focusing on Hasan Piker. Do you know who Hasan Piker is?
I've heard of his name.
So he's a really famous Twitch streamer, actually, originally. He moved over to YouTube and he has some millions of followers across all social media platforms, including a huge following on TikTok as well. I think he's around 1.2 million or maybe higher on TikTok. He is somebody who has previously stated that he likes socialism and likes socialist policy, and basically coming very close to the edge of saying that he himself is a socialist, but hasn't ever actually said that. And he is also Palestinian, so obviously he has interests for Palestinian people and has obviously supported his people through the genocide. And he has, made waves on social media recently, particularly where the far left is concerned, communists and socialists who have followed him, because he hosted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as well as Bernie Sanders recently on his own podcast. And a lot of people on the left had a lot of criticisms of that, particularly because AOC voted on an anti-Semitism package by both Republicans and Democrats, which argued the definition of anti-Semitism included anti-Zionism. So basically, they're conflating Judaism with Zionism in this bill, and it ultimately passed. And then, of course, Bernie had stated that Israel had to defeat Hamas because Hamas was an entity that was threatening to the Palestinian people. Obviously, they are a resistance group. If the United Nations wasn't very pro-America and biased against the Palestinian people, Hamas would be, by textbook definition, considered a resistance group and not a terrorist group. But of course, international agendas are at play, et cetera, et cetera. And in any case, a lot of leftists had a lot of opinions about that. What do you think about that? Yeah.
I'm wondering if he got paid, because AOC has kind of been going downhill for some time now. I think people are catching on to the shift in her narrative and her like radicalism, and it does seem like she definitely got bought out at some point. I mean, the last year.
Well, there's like a narrative actually that AOC, this is a conspiracy theory. I just want to emphasize that this is a conspiracy theory that I'm about to discuss. AOC has been found in multiple instances where she might have been associated with the FBI or with the CIA. And this is because, according to a lot of other conspiracy theorists and people who are on the left who make these arguments, that she came up with the CIA director, essentially bringing her up in government. Like, she has some connections there. It's not like she was just some waitress. And also, the waitress narrative is a classic. It's a classic Quantico program narrative to get operatives into the government. They were like a waiter or a waitress, and that they got into government because they care about the working class, because they've suffered, under being these sort of like low end service workers. So, I mean, there are some rumors swirling that she, might be directly in bed with the American government. Now, Bernie Sanders, he's an explicit Zionist. he does believe that Israel has the right to exist and the right to defend itself. And a lot of people think that this is like not Zionism, but it's actually textbook Zionism. Because the belief that Israel has the right to exist is the fundamental and the core principle of Zionism. Whereas, like, a lot of people view the vitriolic Zionists who are kind of like out in public calling for the genocide of Palestinian people more explicitly as Zionists, but they don't necessarily view these liberal Zionists as Zionists too. I mean, Bernie Sanders, he's always been a Zionist, and he said a slew of other things and voted on several other measures that support Israel. But in any case, yeah, that's where we're at. And Hasan Piker platforming these two Democrats was kind of an interesting move.
Did he do it in like a positive light? Was he like, these are the people we should be rooting for, or was it like a genuine like, why did you flip on us kind of conversation?
Oh, it was 100% a puff piece. And
Mm,
actually, I'll insert a clip here so that people can hear it.
mm.
And let me show you a clip, actually.
What are you guys trying to accomplish with these rallies? Let's get started.
I mean, I think that what the kind of moment that we're in, and also something that Trump was able to exploit, was really practicing, even though he doesn't believe in working class politics, they had a very focused working class strategy. And I think for a while, like, the Democratic Party clearly wasn't effective at that, wasn't successful at that. And I think one of the things that we're here to do is to actually rally a class conscious movement to bring people together and to show that we can fight for a better future, not in marginalizing and attacking people, marginalized people, but actually in rejecting the differences that we have to come together in common cause and to organize folks.
No, I agree.
After hearing that clip or seeing that clip, what do you think about Hasan Piker?
I have a lot of questions, honestly. I have like okay, so if we assume good intent, right? Let's say this was part of the plan, right? What do you think the intention of having them on there was?
I think that I'd like to take people at face value. So I think Hassan was absolutely trying to do something in terms of politicize people in favor of AOC and Bernie. Like, I don't think that that's, controversial to say. Obviously, he likes them, and obviously, he wants them to be a part of his platform in some capacity because he believes in whatever it is that they're saying.
Mm.
Now, the part that I showed you that I think is valuable to notice is that when Hassan asked AOC what she was planning to accomplish with this tour, she basically gave a non-answer, and she said that she wanted people to learn how to fight. But what does that mean, really? Because I don't see any real action. And this is like pretty much textbook Democratic Party. They always say that they want, all this rhetoric around fighting and working class people, but then they vote on measures that ultimately punish working class people. Even right now, after they passed the budget last a couple weeks ago, even after they passed this budget a couple weeks ago, they didn't resist the Republican Party at all. And nobody even came out and publicly crucified any of these politicians who allowed for a lot of these Republican policies to get, really codified. I'm taking Hassan at face value. What are your other questions?
I just want to know what the plan is. I'm like, okay, if the plan, even with the budget, I'm like, okay, if the plan was to roll over and let this happen, then what? Then what? What next? It doesn't seem like there is a plan, or that things are happening on purpose. The first thought that I had when I saw her in that video was that she seems tired. This is like some copy pasta politician response that's happening here that isn't, one isn't answering the question, and two would fall well on like the ears of somebody who wants to hear these things. This would fall well with somebody who is a liberal.
Right. And so the question is, who is a leftist and who isn't a leftist? And I did a video about this on my TikTok a couple weeks ago, and I'll probably plug it in the comments just so people can kind of take a look. But leftism is not capitalist. Leftism fundamentally opposes capitalism. And I think that a lot of people are very confused about why the Democrats and the Republicans work in tandem all the time. But the fact is that both Democrats and Republicans espouse liberal and conservative ideology, both of which are theoretical ideological approaches to capitalism. Before your rights, before any of the social liberty that you believe in, they will always place the value of espousing and holding capitalist values first. They're always going to put the social and economic structure of capitalism before your human rights, before your social liberties. And in fact, a lot of policy that the Democrats vote on is in support of capitalism, even if it's at the cost, especially if it's at the cost of working class people and human rights. This is what we're seeing with Gavin Newsom in California, where he started to work with these transphobic people on his podcast in order to bring in more Republicans, because institutionally they are much more committed to protecting capitalism. They are really afraid of socialist policy because I think that they'll think that it'll wake people up to the fact that capitalism isn't functional. And they disguise this under the systems of government, which is what we call democracy. But the United States is not really democratic, it's an autocracy, it's an oligarchy. So these systems of government are constantly conflated by political theorists, by politicians, and it makes it really confusing for people to understand what's happening to them politically. This is what I think that AOC and Bernie represent. They are people who are hurting the working class towards the capitalist social and economic structure. That's their job, and they're very good at it. Out of all of the politicians, I will say this: AOC and Bernie are really, really good politicians. But that's it.
I really think the difference is the global perspective, right? Because leftists are not pro America.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I think we saw this especially sort of come to a conclusion after the Vietnam War, or what I would say is the genocide on Vietnam, because a lot of sort of radicals really they experienced a lot of suppression from the American government after the genocide, and a lot of it culminated through the expression of COINTELPRO on the Black Panther Party and their dissent and their support of the prisoners of war coming out of Vietnam. So we have a people who basically experienced a suppression and an oppression of their resistance to the capitalist system. So I think a lot of them really feel defeated, because the 40s was really not that long ago. The 50s was not that long ago. And these wars have very real effects on people's living memory today. Like, people remember. And so I think that, they're kind of just throwing their hands up and saying, like, what else can I do for the rest of the world? The United States is an uncontrollable rogue capitalist state. So I think that people have just kind of given up on, changing the system that they live in.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good point. I think there's like AOC and Bernie are both invested in America's power in the global north and the global south. I think that's like at the end of the day, being pro-Israel on that front serves America. It's like an extension, of the American militarism that has existed for a long time.
This brings me to a good segue of something that I forgot to bring into the notes, but I meant to add and I wanted to bring up to you. What did you think about the article that I sent you regarding Vietnam basically supporting Israel?
Oh yeah, I saw that. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm not supportive of it. I'm just really confused because I'm like, how does this actually serve Vietnam? I mean, I know there is a lot of corruption in Vietnamese politics. A lot of it is like it's kind of like America except more upfront. Like, they don't try to hide
Yeah.
the corruption really. There isn't really a lot of voting, like real voting. There isn't a lot of like news or journalism there either. So it is really hard to get information, even if you're living there. So,
Yeah, a lot of Latino commentators are arguing that Vietnam is a chauvinist country rather than a communist country. The difference being that it is communist in name, but in name only,
Mhm.
and that the oligarchs are working in tandem with parties that are not interested in the betterment of Vietnam. Rather, they're interested in the betterment of their own pockets, which is like a classic oligarchy.
Mhm.
So they do advance a lot of social reform, but it's always going to be pro America reform. And this is like, I think, what is happening with Vietnam and Israel, because that's strange to me, particularly because the Vietnamese public, especially the Vietnamese public in the North, they do still espouse a lot of anti-Israel politic. They're very much like in favor of Palestinian liberation. There's been a lot of like Vietnamese graffiti throughout the North that argues for Palestinian liberation. So I think the public is with the people,
Mhm.
but I think the government has been captured for sure.
Mm. I would agree with that.
But anyway, this is also a good segue into international politics.
So let's start with Sudan. What's going on in Sudan?
So, the major development in Sudan is that the Sudanese army gained control over the city of Khartoum, which is very important. It is a central hub. They were able to repel the rapid support forces. And basically, this is a huge success for the Sudanese military. They still have not captured all the way back to Darfur. And I will plug the TikToker who is Sudanese that talks about this in the comments.
Any new updates with Congo?
Not really any new updates. Mostly people are saying that Goma is still liberated and that the Congolese army has been able to retain it, but I don't really know any details. I do know that Focus Congo, which is the primary organization that is distributing support and materials for the Congolese, they are asking for donations pretty consistently and they desperately need them. And I know that they are always looking for people to share and support them. And there's a few other TikTokers and creators on social media who share Focus Congo's videos, and they also are participating in commentating on what's happening in Congo. And I suggest that people follow those. Those will also be in the comments.
What's going on in Palestine?
Palestine is basically back to where we were, and maybe even worse than we were last year following October 7th. I would say that this last week has been as bad, if not worse, than the flower massacre that happened in Rafah. North Gaza is being besieged again, and the Israeli military carried out a genocide operation that ultimately massacred 400 people. They bombed several tents, and it's just not looking good. I have a few families that I'm supporting in my link tree. I highly, highly encourage you to donate to their campaigns. The primary one that needs help is Ezra's family. She has a lot of family members. I actually haven't heard from her for a while because I think it's the media blackout, but I think she's located somewhere where these attacks are not being carried out. So she should still be fine. But yeah, donate to any families that you can find. Make sure that you get connected with any nonprofits that are doing work on the ground. Like people really need help right now. And of course, protest, protest, protest despite the crackdown dissent. Make sure that you are still wearing your kufia out every day. If you are not an undocumented or a green card citizen, make sure that you're, showing up for these protests because the best time to protest is now. The crackdowns are only going to get worse. And I just wanted to also say that these crackdowns are imperialism that is turned inward, right? So this is fascism. That's what fascism is. And the reason this is all happening in succession is because as a community, as Americans, we failed to hold our politicians accountable during a political opening, which was the election. And I think a lot of liberals are still really like beating their chest over vote blue no matter who. But the fact is that for the global south, these politicians are the same. They're the same. The deportations that have been happening under Biden never got this much attention. And I can't help but be a little bit bitter because people are finally paying attention to what's happening at the border. And I've been talking about this since before the genocide, since before. Like, being a Mexican person, it makes you focus on what's happening with all migrants because you understand that they're connected to you and that policy applied to any migrants is going to affect you. So I just feel a little bit bitter, and I wish people had paid a little bit more attention to what was happening during the elections, and that people could have pushed for concessions, or that people would have voted third party, and that at least the Green Party could have gotten, maybe the percentages that they needed. But, no use crying over spilled milk, I guess. I just really wish that people had paid more attention, because I think this is one of those things that, like, because Trump is in office, everybody's putting him under a lot of scrutiny and looking for scapegoats for what he's doing. But the fact is, we're all responsible for not pushing any of these politicians further left and, like, making a reasonable politician enter office.
I think that's a good point. I also think that there's like, we knew this was going to happen too. If Harris had come into office, people would be like, we're good. Don't have to pay attention.
Back to brunch.
Yeah, back to brunch. Everything's cool. Whereas with Trump, everybody's like, he is under a lot of scrutiny, which is good. I think this is like the level of scrutiny that should be imposed on any politician in that seat. But spilled milk, right? This is where we're at, and what can we do from here? That's the next question. But before we go into that, you started going to Mexican politics. Bertie, is there anything that you want to touch on when it comes to Mexico?
Yeah, there's a lot actually. So there's, I struggle to talk about this on my TikTok because there's actually quite a bit of propaganda that's out about Mexico in the context of the trains that Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador imposed on Mexico. These mega projects were projects that were voted on by the indigenous population. Like, we're talking about 70% of the indigenous population that would have been affected by Tren Maya were able to vote. And in fact, like, the government went into the mountains to get people to vote. That's why they had such a high turnout. By the way, 70% is more than Americans vote as a country. So, in my opinion, them voting at 70% of the population. By the way, they passed the measure to institutionalize Tren Maya at 92%. So the overwhelming majority of indigenous people voted in favor of the train, of Tren Maya. And yet, American mainstream media and the UN and all of these other international actors have sided with the United States and have basically argued that Tren Maya is bad for Mexicans, indigenous people. And I think that's really hypocritical, because the Tren Maya was first and foremost built on roads that were already there. And a lot of the blame on the government is very much unfounded, because Mexican people need public transportation because it will reduce emissions and it is beneficial to the environment, which is beneficial to indigenous people. Also, because of this, indigenous people of Mexico voted for an additional expansion on the Tren Maya, which is a reintegration of the Tren Interoceanico, which translates to the Interoceanic train in Mexico. And this is going to be going all the way to Guatemala. This was voted on. Like, indigenous people voted on this. They made this decision. The council is actually still involved, and they're involved in, like, the minutia too. So they vote on all of the small stuff as well. I think it's pretty interesting that, like, the American public believes fully with their whole chest that the Tren Maya was some kind of mega project that was harmful to indigenous people, when in fact indigenous people were able to vote on this and they chose to institutionalize it, and it has been better for them. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it's just the Mexican smear campaign, right? That America has been doing for a long time. It's projection for sure. It's like Mexico is doing all this bad stuff to the environment, and they're so messed up for doing this work. This is another day in America. This is what America does.
Oh yeah, America's fucking companies are out there. Coca-Cola is absolutely devastating the environment. And I told you about this before, but my dad put me on to Vulcan Materials, which is a California-based company that actually is doing ecological damage in the area. And they're using the train to basically hide all of the things that Vulcan Materials is doing in the Yucatan. And so, like, I just think that Americans, when they hear something that's coming out of Western organizations, especially the UN, because even though people don't perceive the UN as a Western organization, in reality it is. And China and Russia do sometimes back Mexico, but when they don't want to get into international conflicts with the United States, Mexico is a pacifist nation. So any of those measures, they might just abstain from voting and they might just not support anybody in those instances. And that leaves Mexico vulnerable because, Russia and China and the other big actors don't want to back a small country that they perceive to be like a bigger burden than they would like to get involved in. The fact is that if you're not hearing from the indigenous people directly, then you probably should not say anything about the train unless you're fully informed. 90% of them voting in favor of the train and a 70% confidence. I don't know what else to say. And them voting on more expansions, like I think that says a lot. I'm always still confused by the American public basically repeating the America forward narrative that the Tren Maya is harmful for the environment. And I will say this, the Tren Maya has a direct impact on American investments because the Tren Maya is invested by Russia and China. So all of its production value is going to other countries. It's not going to the United States. And most of the business that Mexico conducts is typically with the United States.
Well, here's my question, because obviously there's a there's a benefit to this narrative, right, for America. If this wasn't the case, if this was not being like propagandized, if Americans knew the truth and understood like the intentions, the purpose of Tren Maya, what do you think that would mean for America as a whole?
I mean, this is like a classic example of the United States smearing countries that are doing better than them. China is the same, right? China has these trains, these high speed trains that are extremely beneficial to the public. They're cheap, they're quick, and they require very little of the automotive industry. And the automotive industry is a huge export for the United States and absolutely will be impacted by Mexican people not consuming American made cars anymore. And American made cars, by the way, are made in Mexico. So this directly is a blow on the American automotive industry. And it's a good way for Mexico to decrease its interdependence on the United States. And it helps them make a variety of connections with other countries in terms of economic interdependence. So it makes it less risky for them to have a relationship with the United States, which makes it harder for the United States to control Mexico and intervene in Mexican political affairs. So there's definitely a huge interest in that. On top of everything, if Mexico continues progressing and the United States just as a whole people, they just look to their neighbor, they're going to see abortion. Women's rights are codified in the Constitution. African Mexican people's sovereignty is codified into the Constitution. So is Indigenous sovereignty. They have Afro Indigenous councils in the government that have huge political impact and sway. And on top of everything else, they're democratizing their mega projects to the Indigenous population. Like, the United States looks absolutely like it's in the fucking Stone Age if you paint them next to Mexico. And if you're honest about like what's going on over there versus what's going on here. And then of course we have the United States constantly sending the cartel over there. And what I mean by sending the cartel is giving them free guns, free helicopters, free just weapons to go and destroy the social infrastructure that they're building. So I think that the United States has a vested interest in smearing Mexico and making Mexico be its worst self because then the United States will look better.
It's connected to everything. It's connected to our education system, the way that people receive information or don't receive information. It's just like, I don't know. It's a whole beast, America, a self-sustaining beast in a lot of ways. But I think it's starting to crack. I think people and this is I would say it was a benefit of Trump being in office, is that people are paying more attention to this.
There's like a lot there in terms of why the United States has an investment in making sure that Americans view the Mexican train projects, which is a public project that's partially solar and better for the environment, as a negative thing. Not to mention the fact that, like, if we were to look around here, because we're localized to California, if you look at the BART and the Los Angeles train
I know. I
systems,
was gonna say, would this be the same as like if Mexico was like fuck the BART?
it wouldn't, because the BART is disgusting. And the Tren
That's
Maya
true.
is,
It is disgusting.
they regularly clean the train stations. It's like one of the cleanest train stations that there is, like Japan. And they're actually modeling, they actually got consultation from Japan to make them.
Japan does have a really nice train system.
It's clean, it's efficient, and it's always on time.
Mm.
And that's what Mexico's trying to do. Can you imagine if Mexico gets better trains in the United States that resemble Japanese ones, and they're Chinese made and invested also by Russia and China? Like, what can the United States say?
You're ruining the environment.
Yeah, and
That's
that's
what
all
they're
they,
that's what they're saying.
that's literally all they say. And it's like they don't have any proof of this. And the only thing that they can do is sort of tokenize North American indigenous people and the occasional indigenous trader from Mexico to come and talk on behalf of the United States. And that's what they did. They have a American nonprofit who's sort of heading this investigation on the Tren Maya and who made the arguments in court in the United Nations court in the first place. This is not headed by indigenous people who are from the Yucatan that had the ability to vote or were able to participate in the elections in the first place.
Imagine if indigenous people were involved in the creation of BART.
Yeah, can you imagine if the Ohlone or if the, I don't even know which tribes in Los Angeles could vote for something like that. But in any case, what if they could? Like, what if they were able to vote on whether or not infrastructure was built anywhere? Any infrastructure, any mega projects. I've never heard of the United States doing that. In fact, I've heard that the United States likes to grease reservations. They like to grease tribes leaders to get them to invest in projects like oil. Like, it's extremely corrupting, the United States. Whereas in Mexico, they're trying to like basically involve the indigenous general public, which accounts for like the majority of the population. So I don't know. I just think that
I need it to be over. America, not this podcast.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's really infuriating because this whole narrative, I've been really careful to address it because every time that I do, a radical liberal Mexican American will start talking about how like indigenous people this, indigenous people that, and they have no fucking clue about what they're talking about the trains. And it makes me really mad because my dad talks about it all the time about how the trains are really helping the people and like all this stuff, and he's living there. You know, he sees the direct benefits from his friends who like to go to the Yucatan and who like to travel around the area. And he's talking about how the air is improving in the area and like all this other stuff. And then meanwhile, you have like Mexican Americans who don't know what they're talking about, just defending in their own mind, defending indigenous people.
We should go into that in a different episode.
We should
Yeah,
talk about maybe
generational.
yeah,
thing.
maybe one of our video ones, but I'll put it behind a paywall because I don't want these people to come for me. Yeah, I think that like if you don't speak Spanish, if you can't read Mexican journalism, if you can't read things that are on the ground, you're a lot more likely to repeat propaganda that's 100% backed by the West.
Mhm.
So
We'll have that podcast in Spanish.
yeah, both you and I with your palabritas.
Yeah.
Okay. So I do want to move on because we have a really good general topic, but I do want to talk about the PAN real quickly. I've talked to you a little bit about Morena, the political party that I like, but I haven't had a lot of a chance to talk to you about PAN and PRI, but I've told you a little bit. What's your impression of them based on what I've told you?
It sounds like they're kind of the equivalent of the Republicans and Democrats.
Yes, that's a really good way to view them, and Movimiento Ciudadano as well. They are essentially liberals and conservatives, and they are both pro-capitalist sort of entities. They're very much in favor of American intervention. They call for American intervention all the time. They're really, really corrupt. They have really deep connections to the cartel. And every once in a while, a PAN or a PRI former political party member, because most of the politicians are obviously have some sort of affiliation with either of those parties because most of the politicians are older, though that is soon to change. But more info on the judicial reform coming soon. Basically, the PAN party is the far right conservative party. So they are a little bit less Democrat, they're a little bit more Republican, and they are hyper religious, very, very Catholic, very, very like conservative socially, and very into the United States. Some of them even like Trump, like they're very, very much on the right. And recently, the PAN just dropped a bunch of anti abortion billboards smearing Morena, basically saying that Morena allows for abortions at 9 months.
Hmm.
They put a bunch of them all over the state of Chihuahua.
Post-birth abortion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the politician who brought it up to my attention on TikTok, her name is Andrea Chavez. She basically is what AOC wishes she was, and she said that we call that postpartum, not an abortion. That's what the PAN party is doing in Chihuahua, Mexico. And this is because they are under threat right now of basically being fired by the general public because they already voted on a judicial reform and it passed ultimately. This judicial reform basically makes it so that people can vote on all of the previously appointed justices that ranges from the Supreme Court all the way to like magistrates. And basically, what this means is that the PAN, the PRI, and all of the other old school justices are getting their ass kicked out of Mexican politics. So, corruption is going to be impossible. Also, anti nepotism legislation was just passed. So, if you're related to anybody who's in politics, you can't enter office. You cannot enter office.
Hmm.
Or friendly. If you have a proven friendship connection, you can't run for office. Nepotism is kind of like a buzzword in the United States right now.
It really is. I mean, I think it has been for a long time. But this is like how white people come up, you know? This is like, even outside of politics, in employment, the getting different kinds of resources. It's like if you know somebody, then you know somebody. There's a lot of white people in America, in case you didn't notice. And, they know each other.
And they pull each other up. They really do.
Mhm.
I've seen it firsthand. Like, there'll be organizations that tout a lot of like DEI or whatever, but their whole like upper management, everybody in the C-suite, they're all just white people, no diversity. A lot of the times they're just white men. Interesting stuff coming out of PAN. Yeah, let's move on.
Okay. So, what's the drama? The recent drama?
We're going to be talking about cancellations, deference politics, and Republicans versus Democrats. So, we're talking about specifically some drama, and I want to talk about the drama first because originally I was going to put it at the end, but I think it's more useful to talk about why this is coming up for us
Mhm.
and what deference politics are, and I'm going to be linking some sources about that. So, deference politics is a coin termed by Olúfẹ or Táíwò, and it's from a book called Elite Capture that he authored. And basically, this idea is that people should defer to people of color because they're people of color, or that you should defer to marginalized people because they're marginalized people. But of course, we have marginalized people like Nick Fuentes, who is a rabid Nazi. And of course, we have Candace Owens, who's a staunch Republican, who is also, of course, a Black woman. There is like no Indigenous or Black person or marginalized person that is completely apart from their politics. Like being a person of color does not automatically make you a ethical or a more moral human being. So I just wanted to put that definition in there out there first so that people know what we're talking about when we say deference politics. And I wanted to get your thoughts about this.
I thought it made a lot of sense, honestly. It is like, I think it's one of those things where you observe it, but you don't have the language to describe it or like a label to identify what it is. But this was like, I think is also a product of guilt too, where instead of doing the critical work, instead of doing the critical thinking, people who are in more privileged positions or they have more they have more privileged intersections will put the work on someone who is, quote unquote, like more oppressed or more marginalized than them, because they feel like that is the like right thing to do. And we want to like uplift marginalized voices and all of that. I'm thinking about this in the context of work because I've been that person. Like I've been like the marginalized person in the room that is responsible for doing something like radical or whatever for the workplace. And you know what? When I leave, there is a break in the continuity of the work. So every intersection, every identity has a different experience, right? I think there's like different priorities and different frameworks in the way that you would go about solving a problem. And a lot of times these jobs are not sustainable. You're like the one person that is responsible for DEI at a workplace. It doesn't really make sense because
Right.
it is not an individual endeavor.
Right. And so the reason the book is called Elite Capture
Hmm.
is because this is how the elites, meaning the rich, the whites, the plantation class, how they capture the leadership of marginalized people. So deference
That
politics
makes
is one of
sense.
the tools that they use. So I think it's a really useful concept to understand
Hmm.
because there are so many marginalized people that can absolutely betray your cause.
Oh yeah, it
And
hurts more too.
oh my God, it does totally
It
hurt
hurts so
more.
much more when it's coming from your own people. I've been saying that for a long time.
Yeah, well, this is actually how Fred Hampton got. Like,
Mm.
ultimately, the person who snitched on Fred Hampton was a fellow Black Panther Party member. And he ultimately led to the violent shooting that the police carried out and almost killed his girlfriend. I don't remember if they were married or not. They almost killed his wife and child as well. And this is because of a betrayal from people that you presume are people who are folks that you should defer to. And it's
Mhm.
it's just a mistake to not have your own standalone morality because it's very easily captured. I mean, look at what Kanye West has done for all the people who listen to him. We cannot ignore that he has influence. There are absolutely going to be people who are listening to him who believe in the anti Semitic, violent Nazi rhetoric that he's espousing as a Black man. It's just, and it's happening more frequently. And I especially want to refer to the shooting that happened, I think it was either late last year or earlier this year, of the young Black boy that said that he was ashamed to be Black. Like, we also have, again, examples like the Proud Boy leader who's a Cuban. Like, there are so many different people who are easily motivated by capitalism, by other institutions in the United States to betray their own people. And so I think it's a mistake to defer to a people group because they are a people group.
Mhm.
And I was saying this earlier about Mexican Americans basically not knowing anything about Mexican politics because they don't live there. And ultimately, they're being captured by the elites. And only because people are deferring to Mexican Americans about indigenous Mexican politics. It's a mistake to have people who are not directly connected to the source know what's going on. So I don't know. I think it's a pretty interesting concept, this idea of elite capture
Mhm.
and the idea of deference politics. And I think it's a useful tool to have so that we don't defer to people. And especially in the case of Hasan Piker,
Mhm.
him having these politics that are seemingly very much on the far left, it's really helpful to understand that he's been captured by elites. So anyway, tying that back to the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the alternative too is to like educate yourself.
Right, absolutely.
Seek out the information for yourself, create your own opinion.
Yeah, and one of my comrades, She Guevara on TikTok, she's awesome. She talks a lot about how like there's books about revolution.
Mhm.
People have written this stuff out. People have succeeded also. What a lot of people don't know is that the United States is not the center of the world. And a lot of people have been successful in their revolutions. I mean, like, just look at Vietnam. They were absolutely able to successfully beat the fucking brakes off the United States. They there are many other countries that have been successful in staging revolts and revolutions against the empire and have been able to maintain their governments. I mean, look at Cuba. They've also been able to do that.
Okay, so the drama is that there was a kind of a social media blow up on a small business page located in Sacramento. It's a queer small business, meaning that it's was a space that was made for queer folks to congregate and have events and dance and drink and all those things. And it actually involves a few Sacramento queer businesses. But the situation was that a group of people, I'm not clear if they were queer people or if they were like straight people, but they went into these queer businesses wearing MAGA hats or some sort of like MAGA attire. And the queer community in Sacramento, I think most of them took an issue with it, but there's still some division, right, in how people think of the actions that happened after the small businesses and what they did to like address this issue and make it like a queer affirming space.
So, how did the businesses react? What did they do in response to these MAGA queers coming in to the business or to these
So
businesses?
one particular business, their first response that they posted that they deleted was to say that there are also like queer Republicans and this is a space for all queer people, and that in response to this they would make it a rule for people to not wear MAGA stuff or any like hate speech type stuff in these spaces. But that you could be a MAGA person and still go, as long as you're respectful and all that. And they said that in their response to it. The people when they came were, they were responsible. They were, not causing any trouble or anything like that. They weren't there to like, protest. They were just kind of, I think they're there to get a drink or whatever. Um, and people took an issue with that. People were like, you need to, you know, ban all MAGA people, or you need to like make it so that like this is like not a space for MAGA people.
I mean, I really don't know what to say in terms of like Republicans are fundamentally, and I would say that even Republicans, especially in California, are more vitriolic and racist than the ones in the South. Because I would say that like Southern Republicans are obviously like culturally indoctrinated into believing in republicanism and like especially like the MAGA style white supremacist republicanism. And at the same time, I think that we really have to ask ourselves, what do cancellations do? What's the purpose of them? What are we trying to achieve? Because to me, it seems like cancellations are almost always just trying to like eliminate the person from the space, right? And I don't necessarily think that's the best solution
It's very
to,
carceral.
huh?
That's the word, carceral.
It is carceral. It's not just carceral. I don't think it's helpful because I don't think that cancellations in that sense work. Because all that's happened now is that people who are Republican queers are signaled that they shouldn't wear their hats in public. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about their politic. It doesn't say anything about, you know, what their ideology should be. This is coming from a perspective for me as somebody of the global south. Do we have the same energy for Kamala supporters, for people who wore these like brat campaign merchandise? Or what? Because Kamala Harris said that trans people should obey the law when it comes to trans rights. So I just don't think that like we have the same energy for people who are also our enemies. And I would say that like politics and queerness are deeply intertwined. But I would ask if people care about liberals coming into these spaces too. And if they don't, why don't they? That's the other question that I have. It's like, why wouldn't you care if a liberal's coming into your space? Liberals who are also inherently violent to the global south. especially Mexico. Like that Make America Great Again is probably targeted at Mexican queer people, migrants. That's typically what MAGA is in queer spaces. They're people who reject migrants. And I know that a lot of people like to say that it's migrants in general, but I would like to say that it's especially a dog whistle for Mexican people because we represent the biggest population of migrants in the United States. I just think that it's one of those things that like it kind of gives me a little bit of a double standard and like it's a little bit hypocritical because if we don't have that same energy for liberals who can sometimes be worse in terms of how they espouse their stuff, like there are plenty of transphobic liberals. There are plenty of, you know, homophobic liberals, plenty of them. And there are plenty of racist ones too. I would say most of them are racist, actually. I mean, look at Nancy Pelosi in her kente cloth. Like, I just think that this is one of those things that if you're a liberal and you're listening, you're probably going to be upset because the fact is that like I don't necessarily endorse any of these political parties and I don't think anyone is worse than the other, especially not in the global south. So that's first and foremost for me. That's what's coming up for me is that if we're coming after Make America Great people again, then are we also coming after Brat Summer people?
Right. Right. I mean, this is kind of the point of contention, you know, around the vote blue no matter who people. Do cancellations work? I don't think so. I would say no. I think it's a really good way to ensure that people never hear your thoughts. They never get exposed to alternative
Right.
perspectives. I also think that, you know, if you really believe in MAGA, if you're like into all that enough to wear it or like have a bumper sticker on it on your car, then you're also opening yourself up to those conversations, right? It's good. If you believe in that in MAGA stuff, you should go into spaces where that's challenged and be open to those conversations, right? I mean, I would do the same with Harris merch wearer.
Right. Personally, yes. But I don't think that I'm not unaware of the reality that most of the country votes Republican or Democrat. So because I'm aware of this, I just don't think that like canceling people is useful in that sense. And I agree with you in saying that it's not just unhelpful when it comes to specifically keeping people out of those spaces because it doesn't keep people out of those spaces. They just have to not talk about their politics. And even if you ideologically wanted to like be carceral to people and you wanted to say like you wanted these businesses to say like don't come in here because you're a conservative, I don't think that will work because people can just lie about what they believe in. And Republicans can be especially deceptive, and especially ones I would say that are in liberal spaces because they know that their ideology is taboo. They know that. So I just don't think that like it's useful. I think what makes more sense, and this is why Republicans are so successful in capturing so many marginalized people, is to be friendly to them, actually. And obviously, we should let people who are less at risk handle those conversations. Like, obviously, we should challenge our white comrades and counterparts to engage with these Republicans and talk to them frankly about what's going on with them. So I think there's a lot to be said in terms of like how we engage with them. And I will say this also that whenever we have these conversations about should land, whenever we have these conversations, I'm always going to bring this up, which is that despite the fact that white people should engage with these types of people because they are lower risk in these situations, the majority of people, communists, leftists, etc., and radicals that do actually engage in these activities are deeply marginalized people. Most of us who are willing to engage with Republicans in earnest are people who are deeply marginalized and have a lot to lose. I can say that I make a point of talking to Republicans and trying to see if I can bring them over to the far left because they know that they're seeking an extreme solution. I just don't think that they know what that extreme solution really is in terms of actually gaining liberty and what they need for themselves because a lot of them are they're deeply marginalized people. We're talking about a people who like are completely ignored by Democrats. During the hurricanes in the Carolinas, and all of the economic devastation that happened after that, we've basically heard nothing from Democrats. Not even a peep. And this is politics. Like, we should absolutely be in people's faces if we say that, like, we support people no matter what their political affiliation is. Because Democrats and Republicans are supposed to represent the whole country. And this is the other thing that's effective about Trump. He doesn't take it personally if you don't like him. He will try to get your vote by saying anything by any means necessary and by associating with you. He associates with some types that are very interesting. This is exactly happening with Kanye West and his relationship with Donald Trump. Like, I just think that if we really want liberation, we actually have to follow in the footsteps of the Black radical tradition, which kind of segues me into the next component of this, which is Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition. Do you know about the Rainbow Coalition?
You told me a little bit about it, yeah.
So just a review. Fred Hampton basically was one of the last, I think he was the last leader of the Black Panther Party. And one of the reasons that the CIA targeted him in particular is because he was working with a variety of different radical groups. This, of course, included the Young Patriots, who were these poor Appalachians who were white people that were explicit Confederates. And they were looking for liberation, economic liberation for white people of the Appalachias. And they basically saw solidarity with Fred Hampton because they viewed the Black marginalization through the lens of poverty, and that was able to ultimately bring them together. So that, and then of course, there was also the Young Lords that they were working with, and the Brown Berets, and a variety of other ethnic groups that were a part of the Rainbow Coalition, as well as a part of other efforts by the Black Panthers at different times. But in particular, it was the Young Lords and the Young Patriots that they were working with. And I think that this is like a pretty stellar example of really talking to people based on what they need rather than looking at their politic and really sort of finding common ground. And it was so radicalizing that COINTELPRO targeted the Black Panther Party for this program in particular. 80% of COINTELPRO operations were targeted at the Black Panther Party as a result of the Rainbow Coalition. I think it's really our responsibility as people who live in the United States to follow in those footsteps, because Fred Hampton didn't care. He didn't take it personally, anybody's politics. Instead, what he did was he would work with anybody.
Really? I think canceling people is so. I think it's easy. It's the easy way, right? It's like a little bit of conflict avoidance. It's a little bit of like, it's quicker, to just cut somebody out.
It's preserving your peace.
Right.
It's going back to brunch.
Yep, going back to brunch. And this is like so much a part of popular culture, so much of like therapy language too.
I mean, cancel culture is something that therapists are probably able to weigh in on more than any other. Have you ever had a client that's been canceled, first of all?
Yeah. I think everybody has experienced that in some way, actually.
Yeah, I think so too. We have been canceled before.
Yeah.
We've experienced cancellation. What was that like for you?
Stupid. It was bad. I was young, and it was painful because I feel like a lot of the people were canceling. A lot of the main people that were canceling me were people who I thought were my elders, right? They're like maybe like 10 plus years older than me. And it ultimately, it just didn't help the collective, honestly. It didn't help the community.
Yeah, and I think that regardless of who was in the right, I think the other problem is that it completely ignores the other element of all of the radical traditions of the United States and people who oppose carceral politics, which is restorative justice, right? Like, if we're looking to reconcile with people, we have to have that model embedded in each other in different ways. And I do think that therapy has a say in this. Like, I do think that, like, teaching people how to handle conflict and how to not discard people is an incredibly useful tool, particularly if we want people to join us in some kind of a revolution. Like, if we actually do want liberation for everybody, we need to know how to handle people that have different opinions than us. And of course, I will say this is my only caveat for the entire show. If they are white supremacists, like explicit white supremacists, people who aren't just espousing microaggressive rhetoric,
Mhm.
then you have every right as a person of color to engage with them in a way that is violent. Right? We have marginalized people, we have a right to violence, especially for people who intend violence upon us. So that's my only caveat. Of course, we're talking about gay white people who probably don't believe that they're racist. That's my guess.
Mhm.
They probably don't believe that they're racist. And everybody's racist in the United States to some degree. Like, and I think that's valuable and like worth talking about. And I don't necessarily think that Democrats or Republicans are less racist than one another. Hot take. But I do think that the fact is that because liberals espouse more inclusive rhetoric, a lot of people buy into that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the therapy sense, a lot of people's problems come from being isolated, or their problems become worse because they're isolated, or they're isolating. And cancel culture is very isolating. Capitalism is also very isolating. It really just forces you to be alone with your problems, and nobody is around to like check you. I'm thinking about all the times that I was canceled. I don't talk to any of those people anymore, and that is, I think, is the most painful part. And same in this example, right, with the MAGA like merch ban in these groups. Like, these are people who they may never go into a queer space ever again, and what a tragedy that is, you know.
Yeah, I think it's not just a tragedy, it's such a loss of like an opportunity because queerness is an entryway to the left. It's really like you can talk to people about queerness, you can talk to people about Harvey Milk, you can talk to people about Marsha P. You can talk to people about Sylvia Rivera. Like you can talk to these people about the founders of their freedom. And these are all women of color, marginalized people, people who fought for a better world. And the best way to access those kinds of people is through inspiration, not through, exclusion. And I think that a lot of this is also, though, the fact is a reproduction of the stratification that politicians create, right? So, like,
Mhm.
this is just Kamala Harris's platform
Yeah,
being carried out.
this is what they wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
This
Because
is exactly what they wanted.
the Democrats also, like, right now, they're happy to punish their constituents for not voting for them. They're absolutely gleeful about it because they get to charge money. The Democrats make more money when they don't win elections
Mm.
because people think that they just didn't fund them hard enough. Like, I think Kamala Harris was actually, let me fact check this. According to CBS News, Kamala Harris raised more than $1 billion for her campaign. And this was in a very, very short period of time that she had to run her campaign. And she's still sending persistent appeals to donors after her loss. $1 billion.
That's a lot of money. She didn't even need all that money. She could have just been pro-Palestine and got it for free. Honestly,
If she would have, there's so much to be said. Okay, so
I know that's maybe another episode. Processing the election.
so the average leadership pack is about 55 million with an M for Republicans. The average Democratic campaign financing is 16.7 million. And Kamala Harris raised literally $1 billion. It's a lot of money. So the average campaign for Democrats is 16.7 million coming in from the Democratic National Committee, and individual raising is around 30 million for the Democrats. Kamala Harris raised in the very short period of time that she raised for her campaign. And she spent $1 billion, and she's still asking for donations. And she lost. And despite her loss, she's still looking for this money. So anyway, in any case, Democrats still look for they're still campaigning. And the point really being here that despite all this money, Kamala Harris still lost. And despite her policy and her rhetoric and moving right on issues like trans rights, and moving right on issues like TikTok, the military. That was spooky. And actually, I'll insert a clip here.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
Of Kamala Harris and what she had to say about the military. And this is a clip of her saying that she wanted to basically have the most well-funded military in the world. So the biggest, most violent military in the world, something like that. It was absolutely asinine. But anyway, so she says all this stuff, and I think this is her base carrying it out. They're being militant. They're, attacking Republicans left and right. Meanwhile, Republicans have like that Southern sort of, kindness, and they really care about people. And that's why you get marginalized people coming into them. Like, there's, I think, a huge population of disabled people that vote Republican. So I don't know. I just don't think it's a mystery that this is happening still. Basically, the Democratic Party has created a base that has attacked a lot of Republicans, and ultimately that hinders their campaign, and it makes them look really bad. But basically, this is the end of our podcast. So thanks for coming to the second episode of our podcast. This episode should be released on March 31st, but it's regarding the entire politics of the week previous to that. Today, we covered Hasan Piker and his platforming of Democrats. While supposedly being a socialist, we talked a little bit about the global south with focus on Palestine and Mexico. We talked a little bit about the Tren Maya in Mexico and the PAN party. And finally, we talked about canceling people and some small town drama regarding Republicans. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for joining us. It's been fabulous. And thanks for talking with me, Ryan.
Buenas noches.
Say something else.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.